is AJ Fredland. I'm 13 years old and going into 8th grade at Hartford Middle School. I live in Hartford with my dad and in Heartland with my mom. And today on Common Ground, we're here with
Russ Muirhead, and I serve in the New Hampshire House of Representatives, where I represent Hanover, New Hampshire, and Lyme, New Hampshire.
Nice. And I'm Becca White, and I'm from Hartford, Hartford High, Hartford Middle School grad, and I represent the town of Hartford, and I live here.
And I'm Jim Masland. Grew up on the other side of the river, and I currently represent Thetford, Sharon, Norwich, and Stratford.
Okay. So my first question for you guys is, what are your thoughts on how much teachers are being paid in maybe like comparison to someone that maybe doesn't do as much, or maybe their job, don't want to say isn't as important.
Like a college professor.
Or no, I was thinking more of like a professional football player. See, they're getting paid
Tons of money.
They're getting paid a lot of money, and teachers are getting. I looked it up. Vermont teachers are getting. Middle school teachers are getting $43,000 a year. Yeah, and that's.
I mean, in the country, in our overall economy, what we've seen since I was your age is an explosion in income inequality. And if you look at the ratio of the highest paid people in our economy, say CEOs, to the average person, those ratios have just exploded since I was in middle school.
Yeah.
And that's one. Inequality is its own sort of problem and its own sort of thing. A separate kind of question is, are we paying enough to our teachers to attract really good people into the profession who want to stay in the profession and become even better? Yeah. And the answer is no. Yeah. So right now in Vermont, school systems all over the state are finding it extremely difficult to staff their schools. The same is true all over New Hampshire. That's the market telling us that we're not paying enough. Mm-hmm. So the answer is we have a problem. You're right, AJ.
Yeah.
And I'd like to give a personal nod, probably on behalf of all three of us, to the teachers who teach you anywhere in these states throughout the Northeast. Yeah. We recognize, as Russ said, that the market is difficult, and teachers probably deserve a whole lot more, although those of us who followed the economy during the past several years of the pandemic and difficulties with all kinds of employers attracting people to work, that there are a lot of people out there who are probably, I would say, have been underpaid, and their employees in many cases don't have the resources to offer them more. Yeah, so it's difficult all the way around.
Right.
I mean, in teacher pay and the difficulty in attracting people to this profession right now reflects a whole bunch of things. Burnout after COVID, early retirements, also legislative meddling and micro-regulation of what teachers think, say, and do in the classroom, which is making the profession less attractive to intelligent, creative, energetic people. And finally, also, the housing crisis. It's hard to attract people to work for $43,000 when they can't find any place to live that income would enable them to pay for.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, thank you guys for that. It's good to have some insight into that. And it brings me to another thing, like, there's so much need for teachers and so little people wanting to do it. Like, there's need for subs, there's need for full-time teachers, and like bus drivers too. Like, what are your guys' thoughts on that?
Well, it's a very important question, because schools in general aren't just teachers. They're a whole community ecosystem of professionals. Right. And what I've seen is, my mom is a paraprofessional, which means she works with students who have specific needs that can't necessarily be served in a traditional classroom setting. Right. And she gets paid much less than the average teacher in the school, although I would argue she's doing just as critical of a job. So when I look at the ecosystem we have in our schools, we've transitioned the model away from teacher up front, 40 kids. We've instead realized that that doesn't work for the average student. Right. And unfortunately, capitalism doesn't really benefit students who need specialized learning to actually be successful, because that scale isn't built into it. It costs more to teach students to the degree that they need to, or with flexible pathways.
Right.
So I'm wondering, AJ, you've asked the question about pay. Do you feel like there are teachers or people within your school community who are leaving exclusively because of pay, or is it because of some of the larger questions that maybe Russ brought up?
I think probably some of the larger questions.
Yeah.
Like even, I don't mean to make this personal, but my mom is leaving the school. She's
Yeah.
going to do actually what your mom is doing.
Yeah, there you go.
So, at a different public school where she hopefully will receive maybe a little bit more than what she made working at
Yeah.
the private school.
Yeah.
So, I think it's mostly sometimes pay, but usually the bigger questions.
Exactly.
And as all three of us are recognizing, implicit in our conversation, as the world becomes more complex, as society becomes more complicated, the jobs that teachers are asked to do is far more difficult.
Yeah.
Yes.
There more things are being piled on their plate monthly, we could even say. And as Russ said, in states where the legislature meddles with, I could even say messes with what teachers teach, how they teach, it becomes much more difficult. And
Why don't we talk about that?
Yeah.
Have you heard about these changes, AJ?
Well, like how teachers maybe in New Hampshire aren't able to speak about like certain race maybe being responsible for genocide or even slavery.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think we can talk about that. Like,
I mean, on the one hand, the people who are opposed to critical race theory, so-called, abhor teachers teaching the school system, being the locus of education about, you could say, a revision to American history, at least in part.
yeah,
And on the other hand is the belief that I support is if we're going to teach American history about our colonial times before now, we should at least be accurate. We don't have to be in everybody's face about that, but students ought to learn both sides of the equation and be able or free to form their own opinions.
yeah,
But you have to hear both sides of a discussion before you can go about your business and think you know.
yeah,
Yeah, and to the question you've asked, AJ, I think when we look at how we create a better, more equal, just society, it starts with younger generations being able to have information about the wrongs of the past. And something that I've struggled with has been, I took a lot of classes in college around critical race theory. There was a graduate level critical race theory class I couldn't get into. So the concept that we're teaching this high level critical race theory in elementary or middle school or high school is baffling. It's a straw man argument that many people are making to try to demonize the idea that we need to be responding with anti-racism to some of the really entrenched structural problems we have. Because as I'm sure you've experienced, both as a student and being the child of someone who's teaching,
right,
there are ways you can make age-appropriate content.
Yes.
You can
Right.
learn about difficult concepts and understand them differently at different points of your life.
Right.
And what really pains me is when I see elected officials who have an agenda, which is to potentially win another election or to frame up some kind of economic argument for continuing the economic injustice that Russ highlighted, by teaching students inaccurate information or denying them access to that information. That's really scary to me.
yeah, yeah. This is
So you know, in the New Hampshire legislature, a bill was passed and
yes,
signed by the governor
yes,
that does, to some extent, regulate what teachers say.
yeah,
And the background to it are two different views about the American story. And one view is that America is founded on the values of freedom and equality, that it has, in many egregious ways, betrayed those values, but it's also resolved over time to bring its practices and to bring our own attitudes more fully in line with what those values demand. So
Yeah.
it's a story of incremental sometimes punctuated progress. And another view is that actually the story of America is a story of racism, sexism, nativism, and other forms of oppression and domination. And that it's not really, we haven't made as much progress, or in some ways any progress, in really creating a society without oppression and domination, especially for with respect to race.
Right.
And so that racism is really part of the American identity, not a kind of outside thing that's at odds with the core of American identity. So there's these two very different versions of the American story.
Yeah.
They actually could be reconciled if you really want to think it through.
Sure.
But a lot of people, especially people, a lot of people find their patriotism offended by that second story.
Yeah.
And they're worried about their children being raised and taught in a way that will cause them to hate their country, rather than to love their country while appreciating its flaws.
Right.
And so that's the background. I think there are, I wouldn't want to demonize either side here. I think there are deep concerns about how to raise children and what to tell them about the American story and what the truth of that story really is.
Yeah.
And I think legislation is a really, really bad way of getting into this. The New Hampshire legislature ended up passing something very, very kind of curious and interesting. The law says that no teacher can teach students that any person or group of people is morally inferior by nature to other people or other groups. And so the law actually simply says that you can't teach things that are at odds with the doctrine of the moral equality of human beings. You can't teach that some people are superior to others and others are naturally inferior. And so that's all the law says. So a question to you, AJ. What's wrong with a law like that?
Good question.
Well,
If anything, maybe nothing.
Let me jump in here while you're thinking, EJ.
And I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I would want to answer that question.
It's not like we are in class and you didn't do it. I didn't give you any homework.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting, and it's not an obvious. The answer is not obvious. What's wrong with that?
It's an
Professor
excellent
Muirhead,
question,
I hear
and it may depend on how it's applied.
Yeah.
But I would say, back to your little bit broader point, a mentor of mine in Vermont said a number of decades ago, there's nothing wrong with Vermont that couldn't be fixed with what's right about Vermont. And we could say about the USA, there's nothing wrong with America that couldn't be fixed, I would add if we apply it, with what's right about America. And we may remember that in the Gettysburg Address, one of the profound things that Lincoln said, our nation, based on the proposition that all men are created equal, the proposition,
What are
which
you
is...
thinking?
I know, it's women, obviously.
Yeah,
you
go
missed
for it.
a whole, no, you
And
missed
how
a whole
about people?
bit. Yeah, people.
Oh, well, anyway,
that's all right.
go ahead.
We can edit. We can edit, revise.
But at any rate, well, are we backing up, or do
No,
you want,
go,
keep
go,
going?
go.
All right. So, but anyway, Lincoln said that our nation is based on the proposition that all men are created equal. We could say women.
Thank you.
Days. All right, but the key word there is the proposition. It seems to me, the notion that all men are created equal, and as Russ has been saying, can we live up to that? Can we live up to our deals? And how do we do that? And I would suggest it's putting one foot in front of the other, day by day, wherever we are, in whatever context we find ourselves.
So in a sense, this law is allied with Lincoln's statement. It says you can't teach things that are at odds with. You can't teach students that some people are naturally superior to others.
Right.
And deserve, say, to rule or dominate, or others are naturally inferior and deserve to obey. That's what you can't teach.
I hope you gave a floor
So-
speech on this.
The interesting thing is not so much the content, but the enforcement mechanism.
Yeah.
Right, there you go.
And so that's where that's the clumsy thing about laws. They need to be enforced.
yeah.
And so what the Secretary of Education did in the state of New Hampshire is put up a website inviting students and parents and others in the community to report teachers who they think committed instances of speech that violate this law.
Okay.
And then those violations will be investigated. And what happens if you're a hardworking teacher of any grade, just say 6th grade and you're teaching social studies, it's not a nice thing to be investigated.
Yeah.
It kind of wrecks your life. It fills you with worry and distress. And you probably don't have enough money to hire your own lawyer to represent you.
Yeah.
So you're at
Right.
the mercy of the system. And in order to avoid that incredibly unpleasant situation, people avoid any kind of speech that might trigger a complaint. And that's the chilling
Right.
effect of a law
Right.
like this.
Exactly right.
Independent of the fact that I think that the content of the law is perfectly fine. We're not, obviously we shouldn't be teaching people that some are naturally superior or inferior to others. That makes sense. But
And-
it's the enforcement mechanism. And so I think that if there is a problem, that's where the problem might be, AJ, and that's the thing to kind of think about.
Yeah, so what's your next question?
Well,
Just that light one for
yeah, we do have to wrap it up pretty soon, but I think we actually have to wrap it up now, but I have one more question, different topic, just about the 1619 project. And do you think that it has a place in public education, maybe because Vermont was the first colony to abolish slavery, and do you think maybe Vermont has a responsibility to teach about it, or why or why not?
Yeah. So, AJ, I think you've brought up a really important point, which is 1619 is a project that reframes when America, what was our founding, to Russ's point, what was the thing that created us as a nation?
Yeah.
And when you look at the slave trade and how it impacted the United States, it was the bedrock of our economic system.
Yeah.
And in many ways, the trickle effect of that through our history has never gone away. So I think it's so important that we teach that kind of material to young people.
Yes.
What I struggle with is when we have outside forces that claim that to teach that means that you're teaching someone to hate the United States.
Yeah.
I think, in fact, it shows us that we can flourish and we can respond.
Yeah.
And I had the privilege of hearing the founder, or the person who started the 1619 project in Hanover, New Hampshire.
Wow.
And she actually created a really interesting dialogue at that meeting where it ended saying, the alarm bells are on. The house is on fire. Democracy is in deep trouble. And not only is it in deep trouble for us right now, but for all future generations. So I think that your point is very well taken with what do we teach, how do we teach it, and are we going to be able to educate the next generation to respond to some of the foibles we've made of the past.
Yeah.
So.
AJ, I have to say, as a teacher,
Yeah.
when I teach, I try not to teach dogmas and doctrines.
Right.
And I try not to, invite my students just to repeat things that other people have said or advanced, but to give them the tools they need to critically evaluate things.
Okay.
And so whether it's the 1619 project or any other project or any other idea,
Yeah.
I think the real key to education is to empower students to think for themselves.
Yeah.
And one of the really useful things about provocative theses, and people think of the 1619 project as provocative, is it stimulates people to really think for
Totally.
themselves.
Yeah.
So I think it's something you could use to very, very good effect in a classroom.
Yeah. Okay. Jim, do you have anything to say, or?
Just not to put New Hampshire on the hot seat all by itself. We don't have a law such as you do, or an enforcement, but there have been instances in towns of larger school systems where certain parties have been up in arms about what they thought was being taught in this school or that school, and we certainly have had our critical, shall we say, arguments about what's proper and what's not. Fortunately, the school's been out of session for now since June or something, and those things have been superseded by other arguments, other things that we can talk about. But I wouldn't want anybody listening to this film segment to think that New Hampshire has the
only issues.
has the I'm not sure the word I'm looking for. is the only bad one around here, because that's not the case. This sort of difficulty pervades our whole country. People have opinions tightly held, and we're having a darn hard time working them out.
Yeah, we're not exceptional.
Yeah. All right, and I appreciate all of this. Great answers. Thank you, guys. And
Thank you.
Yeah.